In this video, we are going to talk about variables. Let's get to it. Like always, if you're new to this channel, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe below. And click on that bell icon so you get notified for new awesome videos just like this one. So now let's get into variables. Now with variables, this is probably something that you already heard probably in your math class, and they work pretty much the same way. As you remember, inside of our math class, essentially what a variable is something that takes care of another value. And we sometimes have to find those values by doing equations or some sort of math to get that value. Part of that kind of transitions into the coding base here. So let's get into what is a variable, and then we'll talk a little bit more about variables. So essentially, a variable inside of the coding world allows you to store references to a particular object. And what I mean by objects is just anything within the coding world, such as a person, place, or thing, or a string or array. Any other data types, it could be stored in a variable. With variables, there are multiple ways that you can use them. The best way that you will be using them is by storing references, such as to set aside a particular value to be able to use later on or multiple times within your code. The other thing is that you also have the ability to assign new values to your variables. So you're having the ability to change the initial value of what it originally represents. And if you are reusing things over and over again, instead of copying and pasting that whole entire object all over your code, a better thing to do is just to use it once and define it once within a variable and then reference that variable within your code. That way your code is a lot more cleaner to use instead of having a bunch of reusable code that is able to be cleaned up. Before we go into variables, there's something really important that we have to talk about, and that is scope here. With scope, it is essentially where you have access to the variable, because depending on the language as well as depending on the type of the variable it is, you only have certain access to the variables at certain places within your code. So let's take a look at all of the different scopes. These are the most common ones here. You have your global scope, that is machine-wide scope, which means you have access to it throughout the whole entire machine. Through every single project, you have access to that particular scope. File-wide scope, you only have access to it within the file itself. If you're in another file, you don't have access to the variable. So within a class and instance scope, you have access to it within the class itself, as well as anytime that you're using the class. Now this is probably the most common one that you'll encounter, which is the local scope. Essentially what the local scope is within a code block itself. So within a set of curly brace or if-else statement or within a method, wherever it is you define it, that is the scope that it has. And these are the different scopes. You are very limited of how you will be using variables depending on these scopes. So depending on each of these, you have access to your variables at certain places within your project. So you might be using different scope depending on different use cases within your project. When you are creating variables, also think about the scope as well. So now let's go into variables. So how variable works is that depending on your coding language, there might be a keyword right before your name of the variable. And that really does depend on the language. Some languages you don't even need a keyword, some languages you do. So you have to take a look at whatever languages that you're working in, make sure you know the keyword, as well as if it represents a different kind of scope. And we'll go into some examples so you can see how that really plays a huge role of what kind of variable it is. After the keyword is the variable name. And within the variable name, this is what you are calling each of the variable. And with each of the variable, it comes with a specific name to be referenced. And this has to be very unique within scope. So if you have the same exact name variable within the same scope, it might get confused or it might get overwritten with the newer variable that you define. So make sure that when you are naming stuff, it has to be a unique name within the scope that you're working in. And then it's followed by the equal sign. And within the equal sign, we talked about this a little bit before, this doesn't mean equality within the coding world. In most cases, this means assignment. And we use assignment especially with variables. So when you want to have assignment or reassignment, you are using this single equal sign here. There are other symbols for equalities. If you missed that video, don't forget to click right here on that card. And then finally, on the right side is what you are assigning the variable to. And again, this is an object, a person, place, or thing, or an array, string, any other data types. Whatever you want to assign to a variable, you have access to it on the right-hand side. So let's go ahead and take a look at some examples. So here you can see that we have the exact same variable, but is in multiple languages. We have JavaScript, locally scoped, and many languages, Ruby, and a little bit of Java and C#. So with this, the only difference between all these variables is whatever language that you're using. And depending on language, you would have like a keyword or a unique identifier for variables, such as var, @ or a string, like so. But the whole structure of how a variable works and how they're used, they're all the same throughout any language, so that doesn't change. So here we have a variable called name, and we are assigning that to be a string of Bob. And same thing with all of these here, it's just in a different language. And then if we want to use this string, we can just reference it by the reference name of name here. And I'll show you how that works a little bit later in the video. Now, you also have the ability to do reassignment. So with reassignment, you can use the variable that you have already defined, and you can change the value to be a different value than what it was originally. But be careful when you're doing this, because some languages may restrict you on data types. So if this is initially a string, you can only reassign it to string in some languages. But in other languages, they don't really care about the data type. So you can actually rename this into like a number or array. It really doesn't matter. But for those pickier languages, make sure that you follow those practices and make sure that you're doing the same data type for each of the assignment as the declaration. And how you would do a reassignment here is you just call it by the name of the variable name that you have declared as, and the equal sign, but without the keyword. In most languages, you don't need the keyword. You can just reference it by name. And then after that, you can reassign it to a new value of what you want. Now let's talk about naming. And I'm more specifically talking about naming your variables, because there is a best practice of how you should be naming your variables. Because if we are just naming our variables anything we want, which technically you can, and it'll still work and it'll still run, it won't be as helpful when you're looking back at the code or when you're working with other people. So, and the first bullet point here is that when you're naming, you need to be specific. The reason being is that if I name my variable X or Y or 4, I don't know what that represents. So a better thing to do is to rename it into something more specific of what it is I am assigning to that variable, like such as name, age, array of cars, things like that. That's actually a lot more informative for me as well as other people when I'm using this variable. Now, you should also follow the language's best practice. And since variables change a lot throughout every single language, but the base fundamentals of how they work, they all stay the same. But the things that do change is how the keywords work. So you might have to use different keywords in different languages, or how you're naming them, such as if it's a double word, such as last name, instead of having them be together, it might be camel case or snake case or whatever case that the language prefers. You have to follow those best practices, or else it will look bad on your part and it makes you look very inexperienced within the language itself. So that's why you should always follow and learn the best practices of the language you're working in, and then also use the right scope. And if you just have everything as globally scoped, which technically works, but later on, if you accidentally have the same variable with the exact same scope, then it will get confused of which one you're talking about. So to alleviate that problem, instead of having everything as a single scope, you need to change your variables around to make sure that they work where they should be and have access to the right scope. And then lastly, when you are naming your variables, don't use any keywords within the language. And those come with like class or null or string, things like that is part of the system itself. It won't be technically correct when you are having those keywords be also variable names because it doesn't know which one you're referring to again. So I would stay away from those particular cases of like if you need to have it called class, just call it course. It's a very similar synonym. And I wouldn't use anything crazy like any symbols because symbols like the @ sign or octathor or %sign, they may mean something else in the language. So I wouldn't even use that within the naming of my variables. So let me go ahead and show you some bad examples of some variables. And this is something that a lot of people make just to make it simpler for them, but it makes it a lot more harder for you to understand what's really going on and also to help other people. So if you take a look at this, we have a variable of x equal to array of apple, orange, and grapes. Well, I don't know what x is, and if I see x being used throughout the whole entire file, I will be even more confused. So this is very broad of just labeling it as x. And then here, this is using a keyword of class. Class is a already taken term in most languages. So this will actually give you an error saying that you are technically using class wrong. Even though that we are using it as a variable, it will think that we're using the language of the class, and that's not correct. And then finally, if I name all of my variables as symbols, that looks like I just swore within the keyboard or something. Yeah, that's not helpful at all. And like, do you want to type all that every single time that you are using the variable? No, right? So it's better to stay away from crazy symbols unless they mean some sort of scoping. Then I would use a scoping language. So here are some better examples of variable names. So here for the first example of what we have previously in the previous slide is instead of saying x, we just say fruits because it's an array of fruits. We're just being more specific here, telling what it is and everything. And here we're using the synonym rule where instead of class, which is a reserved word, I'm just using courses. It means the exact same thing. And then here, instead of using crazy symbols, I'm just summarizing it into num instead of numbers because num is a lot more shorter than numbers. So that might be better to type later on instead of number. So if you want to use a variable, all you need to do is call it by the name. So if you call it by the name, it will return the value that it is assigned to. And there's two ways for you to have this work. First of all, you need to create the variable. You can't just use it and then expect it to know what fruits is. And then second off is that you call it by its name. So what this name does is that technically this is the whole array of the fruits here. So you're actually putting this whole array within the map and mapping through each and every single one of those and printing them out. And be careful when you do this because you may have access to fruits within the scope or you may not. So make sure you know where you're defining it and where you're using it because those depend on scope as well. Because if I have this defined in another file and it's a file-wide scope and I'm using this in another file, then I don't have access to that variable because we're not in the same file. So be careful with scoping with that too. Now the other two use cases of variables is with strings. And you can use this with string interpolation and string concatenation. First, let's talk about string interpolation. So with string interpolation, what you're able to do is you're able to use values that is assigned to a variable or whatever reference that you have, and you can inject them within a string. So this really depends on the syntax of how it's done within the language. So here's how you would be able to do in Ruby, and then this one is how you are doing it in JavaScript and ES6 and beyond. So typically you would need a string inside of string interpolation because that's just part of the name. And what you would have is that inside of this particular case, this might be a variable that stores a individual's name. And most cases, you're not going to have it hard-coded like so, right? We know that the name here is Sam, but we might set this variable equal to whatever the user types in inside of the keyboard. So we can't really expect that. We can just set it to a variable of whatever the user input is. And depending on their user input, we know that we're calling it person. And then inside of the person variable, it has the username, and we're just going to use that to our advantage to display a string using string interpolation. The symbols really depend on the language. Don't worry about the exclamation point. It's actually a punctuation. It has nothing to do with the symbols at all. So that's just for punctuation to make an exclamation point. But here, if I say hello person, is what person represents, which is the user's name. So it will say hello Sam. And then this is just another language. It'll do the exact same thing. But again, this is really good for if you don't know the value, you are setting the variable to that value and then using that value within a string to print to the screen or whatever it is you need to do with it. And that's string interpolation. String concatenation works a very similar way. The only difference is how it works. And with string concatenation, all you need is strings and the plus sign. And with the string concatenation, it actually makes things into a bigger string. So usually with the plus sign is with addition. So if you're using numbers with the plus sign, it will add the numbers together. But if you're using strings and adding them together, it's technically concatenating them, which is putting them together into a bigger string. So same example that we had previously, but in this case, we're actually going to be using string concatenation instead. But this is another way for you to print the same message by using a different technique. So here we have our variable here that represents the person's name. And with string concatenation, all you need is the first string and also another string, or you need to parse it within a string or have it convert to a string. And if you put the plus sign in between them, it will actually combine them into a bigger string. But you probably noticed that it takes it very literal. So if you actually smush this string and this string together, it will say hello Sam, but there's no space in between them. So if you want to have a space in between them, you would have to also concatenate a space in between those words for it to be hello space Sam, because that's much more readable than if it's right next to each other. And if you take a look at this, it only works within strings. So if we have the string of 4 concatenated with another string of 4, that actually does 44, which you think would be 4 plus 4 equals 8, but these are technically strings, not numbers. So it does depend on the data type, and if it's a string, it will concatenate them together side by side. And that is string concatenation. So let's go ahead and wrap up what we discussed so far. In this video, we talked about a lot of topics. One of them is called scope, and that is where you have access to variables. Again, variables are items that you are able to be stored as a reference for you to use later. And with them, you may have certain keywords that define those variables, and those depend on the language itself. And when you're naming them, there are certain practices that you should be following, such as you shouldn't be using any of the language keywords such as class. You should also be specific when you're naming them, and you should also not use any crazy symbols with them. When you're using a variable, all you need to do is that you need to define the variable first, and then call the variable by its name and assign it to another value, or you can use that variable within string concatenation or interpolation, or within the logic that you're using, or you can use it within your logic anywhere in your code. So with string interpolation, you are taking the value that you want to interpolate within a string. And concatenation actually just puts two strings together to make it into a bigger string. And that is all we have for variables today. If you have any comments, be sure to post it below inside of the comments section, and I will see you in the next video. See ya!